for today is pandemics, and not just this pandemic, but several. For many of us, the word pandemic came into our everyday vocabulary only in the last 1 year, almost exactly a year ago when it was declared a pandemic. But our speaker for the day has been looking at pandemics over the past 200 years or more, rather than this past year. So we will learn from our speaker on how those pandemics of the 19th century and the early 20th century happened. What did the world do, and what could we have learned, or what have we learned, or what have we not learned from those, and what can be done going forward as pandemics become more frequent and more a part of life. There are two firsts in today's webinar, two things that we've never done before. Firstly, our guest speaker, Professor Chinmay Tumbe, has been on the show before last year. So this is the first time we are having an eminent guest coming to our show twice. As many of you will recall, Professor Chinmay Tumbe was on this show last year to talk about migration, and based on his book about migration. He liked being on the webinar so much that he promptly went back and wrote another book, this time on pandemics. And he's here to share his learnings from this second book. And he's just promised us that every time he writes a book, he'll come on our show. So we will hopefully see Professor Tumbe many times. Briefly, Professor Chinmay Tumbe is Assistant Professor in the Department of Economics at the Indian Institute of Management Ahmedabad. He holds a master's from the London School of Economics and Political Science, and a doctorate from the Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore. Chinmay has worked at various prestigious places, including being a postdoctoral fellow at the Migration Policy Center, European University Institute in Florence, Italy. He was also with the School of Public Policy and Governance, Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Hyderabad. As I said, there are two new features in today's webinar. So one is Professor Chinmay Tumbe's second appearance at our webinar. The second new feature is, as you all know, we usually have been having a professor from our university holding the conversation with our guest speaker. Today, for the first time, we have a student holding this conversation. Asha is a brilliant student in our MA Economics program. And she's also a prolific blogger and a writer and a researcher. In fact, she did a significant amount of research for Chinmay's book on pandemics. So we couldn't have had a more qualified person to conduct this conversation. So without taking too much of your time, I will get out of the way and hand you over to Asha to start the conversation. Asha.
Thank you, sir. So good evening and good morning, wherever you are. Thanks to everyone for tuning in. And thanks, Professor Chinmay, for joining us again. We're very happy to have you.
Thank you for having me over.
Yeah. So, I was just thinking the other day that there's like when someone who is not in the field of economics thinks of what an economist does, you think of somebody informing the fiscal policy or, making the forecast for a company, for the company's growth. And that seems far removed from, having a say in what happens during a pandemic. But I would posit that actually your previous work and your experiences have prepared you for such a time as this, right? So can you please tell us a little bit about what your journey has been like that has, culminated in you writing this book? And also, would you have foreseen such a thing when you were my age?
Yeah, sure. I mean, firstly, this question on how does a trained economist write a book which is primarily on epidemiology related events? Well, there is a similarity between the two disciplines. Both are terrible at forecasting. Economists, the standard joke is, economics exists as a discipline to make astrology look respectable. It's just economists cannot really predict, more than a year's. There are good studies on this which show massive forecast. If you take the IMF forecast, for example, on GDP growth, very bad forecast 2 years out and so on. And similarly, epidemiologists, it's very, very tough to model disease outbreaks. The range of estimates we got just last year on potential deaths goes from practically nothing to millions and millions of deaths. Right? So huge, it's very, very difficult to forecast both economic as well as epidemiological events. But my entry into this field comes from migration. And migration as a topic is an extremely interdisciplinary topic. And I love to do such research, and that's why migration is a fantastic topic to study. And when one studies migration, one realizes that there have been events in history of epidemics which have driven migration. That is, this classic flight from cities and villages and so on have been there throughout history. So in my first book, for example, India Moving: A History of Migration, I do mention words like plague, I do mention words like cholera and so on. And this new book is based on that. During my PhD thesis at IIM Bangalore about a decade ago, I had actually drawn a map on the population growth rate of India between 1911 and 1921, which shows how bad the influenza pandemic of 1918 was in devastating populations of India. The numbers are staggering, 20 million people dead and so on. So in a way, I had already seen the impact of epidemics, of pandemics on migration. And the real connecting theme is that while you might think there's no relationship in a way between India moving and the age of pandemics, when you think about it, every pandemic requires some migration. Or to put it another way, you cannot have a pandemic if there's no migration, right? Because pandemics are by typically human exchanges. And so that is why, and to curtail a pandemic, you do need to curtail migration to a certain extent. Right? And so there is actually a very intimate relationship between migration and pandemics. And of course, we saw that relationship play out last year when we had this migration crisis and so on. So in a way, there are linkages. But to this idea of, could I have seen that I would be writing a book? March 13th, 2020, exactly 1 year back to the date, I still had no idea that I would, write a book on pandemic. So this is a very, quick project, which I just thought it had to be done, and that's how I got into it. But last year, almost to the day, the WHO, announced the word pandemic, and that's really what got me thinking, saying that maybe this book needs to be written, and that's how I got into this.
Right. So following from that question, when the WHO declared it a pandemic, let's lay down some groundwork before we progress. So at an elementary level, what is the difference between an epidemic and a pandemic? Can you say that an epidemic is also a pandemic? And I mean, who assigns this terminology, and does that affect the response to combat it?
Yeah, for those who don't get it, Asha's joke was on, who assigns it as a pandemic, and it is really WHO, the World Health Organization, which assigns it as a pandemic. Pandemic, there are, of course, a lot of problems in having a precise definition of pandemic, but typically it is understood as simultaneous transmission of a disease around the world. Now, when you say world, we mean a large geographic area. So typically the working definition I take in my book is at least 3 continents. But you've had stuff in the past. There's something called as the Justinian pandemic, which is from the 6th century. It really did not go to the American world. It was pretty much a Mediterranean world pandemic, but it's still called pandemic. Some of these things in terms of conventions of how historians look at it. But broadly, we would say, malaria, for example, is found in many parts of the world, but very rarely would we call malaria a pandemic, right? Because we are not really seeing it transfer simultaneously from one point to another at the same time. Now, it could be that over 5,000 years, malaria has gone from one place to another. So you might think it's a pandemic over 5,000 years. But that's why the variation over space and time matters. Right? And so that is why we rarely call malaria is one of the biggest killers historically, but we never have really characterized malaria as a pandemic. But we consider disease like cholera, which was endemic in India. There are 3 words: endemic, epidemic, and pandemic. The word pandemic comes about in day-to-day language only really after the 1918 influenza pandemic. So before that, the words used in general discourse was more of endemic and epidemic. Right? So the cholera epidemic, the plague epidemic in India. And in official documentation in India, after the 1918 flu pandemic, what is commonly referred to as the Spanish flu, the Indian government had a document called a preliminary report on the influenza pandemic. So that's probably the first time the word pandemic was used in an official government document in India. But then, of course, it picks up, and of course now we all use this word. So what's different between endemic, epidemic, and pandemic? Endemic, if it's there, we say cholera is endemic in Eastern India, or dengue is endemic now in many cities of India. And of course, it breaks out in a particular year for many regions. We say if it is an epidemic form, and if it crosses continents, we're calling it a pandemic. So that's the difference between these three terms.
Sure. So then, I mean, something like the Justinian plague, right? Is it possible to still call it a pandemic because it happened under the Roman Empire? So, in terms of its reach,
yeah. So, from today's parlance, no, right? No, we would say no. But the point is, in their times, it was seen to be very, very widespread.
Okay.
The global population was also very different, and that is why historians have characterized the disease plague into three pandemics. So, the Justinian pandemic is called the first plague pandemic. It's a convention historians use. So we are talking about 6th century CE, Justinian being an emperor of the Byzantine Empire. Then this Black Death, which is a very famous event in European history, is in the 14th century. So 6th century CE is the first plague pandemic. 14th century is considered to be the second plague pandemic. And the late 19th and early 20th century is considered to be the third plague pandemic. So for one disease, three pandemics have been historical. Now you can open up this question of, was the 6th century really a pandemic? By today's definition, actually not. But now this is a convention that most people are using. And even like the 14th century pandemic, it's not that plague, nothing happened in the world, no plague happened in the world between the 14th and the 19th century. For example, Ahmedabad, where I'm based in right now, had a devastating plague in the early 19th century. So plague has hit many parts of the world at different times. But as a generalized, transmission across the world, we say, or large geographical area, we say 6th, 14th, and late 19th century.
Right. Because I find that the periods in which these plague epidemics occur, it does overlap a lot. And in fact, I think before COVID broke out, plague was still a huge thing in like Madagascar, and there are antibiotics to treat it. But yeah, that's true. Right. So your book, This Age of Pandemics, it traces the history of cholera, plague, and the influenza, right? So could you give us like a broad sweep about when these pandemics occurred, and maybe what are some of the common threads that run through them? And the focus of the book, of course, it mentions the rest of the world, but also that there is a lot of emphasis placed on India. So can we what can we say about the Indian response? Like, has it gone from strength to strength, or it's just become worse?
Yeah, so this book which I've just written, it's called The Age of Pandemics, 1817 to 1920. There's a particular reason why I've used these years, and it's called How They Shaped India and the World. In this period, cholera, plague, and influenza. Cholera starts out, it breaks out in Eastern India. Cholera has been with us like plague for centuries, but cholera becomes a pandemic, it becomes virulent, starts going around the world from 1817 onwards. So this is particularly unusually virulent outbreak from Jessore in Eastern India. It goes to Calcutta and then overwhelms the Indian subcontinent in 2 years. And then it takes several decades before which, so this is a pandemic which is taking a long time for it to really become a pandemic, because we didn't have the railways, we didn't have the steamboats. So it was a very different world in the early 19th century. But cholera, until case fatality rates in cholera were more than 50%. So remember, we're talking of the COVID-19, the case fatality rate is something like 1.4% in India, which means that if you, out of 100 people who get it, 1.4 die on average, right? Case fatality rates of cholera was more than 50%, which means if you got cholera, there was a 1 in 2 chance that you would die. And these case fatality rates started for most of the 19th century were very high. They start going down only in the early 20th century. And after the 1920s, they start going down further because of better treatment methods, IV methods, intravenous methods, and so on. And by 1960s, finally, this oral rehydration therapy is formed. So today, if you get cholera, it's no longer dangerous because we have we also have vaccines, but we also have ORT, oral rehydration therapy, to cure it. So that's the brief story of cholera. It devastates many countries of the world, especially India, Egypt, and Russia. So geographically, but it also hits Europe, it hits North America, it hits South America. Gabriel Marquez has his famous book, Love in the Time of Cholera. So it kind of shows you how cholera had settled down in many parts of the world. So this is the story of cholera, and the peak part of cholera in India in particular is 1817 to 1920. On plague, we say the second or third plague pandemic starts from the 1890s. It kind of comes from China, most accepted theory. It lands on Bombay and then it spreads. As I said, this was not the first time the plague had come, but plague really, hits India hard between 1896 and about 1920s. So again, by 1920s, it's on the kind of, a path out. And interestingly, plague does not go out because of better treatment methods or, better vaccination and so on. It is because of herd immunity, but not herd immunity of human beings. It's herd immunity of rodents, because plague disease, as people found out after 1905, is caused when this particular bacteria goes from rats to humans via rat flea bites. And so if rats are immune to this disease, then rats don't die. And then the rat fleas don't have to leave the rat bodies and go around biting human beings. Right? So it's remarkable that plague cycles in history are closely tuned with immunity cycles of rodents and plague. So that's the most accepted theory of how plague actually goes out, not because of human intervention. Having said that, by 1940s, there was DDT, there was antibiotics. And so plague being bacterial disease is again not as life-threatening today. So case fatality rates of plague today are very, very small. Having said that, when there was an outbreak in Surat in 1994, you saw kind of a scare it created, and that was kind of nipped in the bud. So plague is, we're saying, from 1890s to about 1920s. And then influenza pandemic is the greatest pandemic of all times in terms of mortality, barring maybe this Black Death event of the 14th century. Right? So more than 70 million people worldwide have died. To put it in comparison, the COVID numbers right now, 1.6 million. It's quite unlikely that COVID will take more than 70 million people. And that 70 million number came about within a year or so. Right? So, and the global population was also much smaller. So 1918 to 20 is this terrific pandemic called, the influenza pandemic, unfortunately known as the Spanish flu. Now, why is this the age of pandemics? Is because if you add up cholera, plague, and influenza, and in certain years, all three were there at the same time, the total mortality as a percentage of global population turns out to be about 5%. This has not really been the case for any other century, barring maybe the 14th century. And hence, this is a totally unusual period of global history. It is not that we can call ourselves as the age of pandemics because we have COVID. Of course, we are living through a particular age of a pandemic. But what I'm arguing is this wasn't, if you look at all the centuries that we know about, last 20 odd centuries, this particular period, 1817 to 1920, really stands out. And we really not seen it as such. We typically see it in terms of age of empire, age of capitalism, age of globalization, but we're really not calling it age of pandemic. So that's one of the main arguments of the book. And the second argument is that actually India was the epicenter of mortality in all the three pandemics, which means out of the, my numbers are, about 20 odd million people who died of cholera, more than half were India. Out of 13 million people who died of plague, 12 million were in India. So more than 95% of the deaths. And in the Spanish flu or the 1918 influenza pandemic, out of the 40 million plus people who died, 20 million, and these are my numbers using statistical methods and so on, there are about 20 million died in India. So in each of these pandemics, India was the worst affected region, and it has left its mark in memoirs, a variety of things of those times. And when COVID struck last year, the kind of WhatsApp forwards I was getting was India has never been hit by pandemics, or worse, India has never been the source of pandemics. And yet for about 100 years in this time period, people used to look down upon India, just how many people look down upon China and the wet markets. India was seen to be as an originator of pandemics for much of this period. So a lot of this kind of, thought process in last March kind of troubled me, saying that we've kind of really lost the memory of these pandemics. And that's why this book was written.
Yeah, so I mean, especially because India had been so badly impacted, it's really quite baffling as to why, the memory is not preserved better. So when we study in school in history, we know that in 1990 in Jallianwala Bagh happened, and the massacre there, and those sorts of things. But lots about wars, and maybe one or two mentions of famines, but not much emphasis on this, or hardly anything at all. So some of the explanations I've heard about that were because at that time we were in the midst of a world war and we were a British colony, and so that's what took the spotlight. But if that's the case, I mean, it also means that lots of troops are losing their lives, and troops are also vectors, right? So why don't we see at least influenza having some better preservation in India?
I think it's about how memory is created. Very rightly put. We learn about wars, we learn about Jallianwala Bagh tragedy, and we commemorate those events. So 2 years back in 2019, we had like 100-year memory of commemorating this particular Amritsar massacre of people 1990. So the first reason why pandemics and epidemics are often forgotten in history is simply because we don't do enough to capture it in our history textbooks and so on. And the reason is because there is no clearly identifiable enemy. Right? So we can say that Jallianwala tragedy, there is a particular enemy. So the British have this whole thing about World War II because Germany is the enemy for Britain. Mm-hmm. And for much of our history of the 19th and early 20th century, if you see what is our history, what we learn, it's about the rise and fall of the British Empire in India. In fact, we don't learn in our history of textbooks much about Nizam ruled Hyderabad or Mysore or the princely states. The bulk of it is British rule, freedom movement, and the British going out. Right? And yet what I'm showing is actually much of the freedom movement is also back-ended by pandemics in this country, right? So that's one of the reasons. The other reason is pandemics, unlike other classes of events which leave mass mortality, like a flood, like an earthquake, like a war, pandemics only destroy people or labor and not capital. Right? So it's not destroying buildings, it's not destroying institutions, it's typically destroying just people, unlike say war and so on. And so the visual memory of pandemics is not well captured. If entire cities crumble down, people will make a note of it, travelers will make a note of it, and this then enters documentation. Pandemics kind of quickly slip out. Having said that, the people who lived through this age of pandemics themselves thought that this would never be forgotten. The Norman White, who was a sanitary commissioner of India, the leading health official, he said that the kind of trauma which was seen in 1918-20 during the influenza pandemic, he said, we will never forget this. Right? And yet we forgot it. So within a generation, once that generation had died out, not sufficient documentation had taken place, and future pandemics were complete. So by the time we reached March 2020, this whole thing of pandemics were completely erased in our collective memory, especially in India. And I should also say, India, we got lucky that we've not really had a major pandemic since 1920. And that's another thing about pandemics. They can start anywhere in the world. For example, cholera was Eastern India, plague, often people say China. Influenza pandemic, most likely source was America or USA. So pandemics can start at any time, start at any place, and they can start at any time. The time period lapse between two pandemics can range from a few decades to some centuries. So we don't really have a documented pandemic in the 18th century for that matter. Right? And so that is why the memory kind of quickly goes up. But there have been societies which have collectivized memory. For example, Black Death. So in European history, Black Death is a huge event. And people say Black Death led to Renaissance, Black Death ended feudalism. So students in Europe grow up knowing about at least one pandemic, called the 14th. And if you see what happened after the Black Death, it's precisely because of that memory that informed a lot of the decisions, saying plague should never enter Europe again. And that kind of informed the decisions when they were trying to battle plague in India in the late 19th century. Right? So there was a sense of memory. Plague devastated London in the 1660s. They said we should never happen again. And plague actually never really hits Europe after 1720 when it hits Marseille. Right? And so they're obsessed about plague because they know it is a very dangerous disease.
What it can do. Yeah, right. So and is it also to an extent, when we brought up this point about the unknown enemy, right? It's also a question of not improper documentation, right? Because for influenza, we sometimes the characteristic, and this happened with smallpox also, sometimes the characteristics of the symptoms of that disease are very similar to what something else might be. And so you're not really clear all the time how many people exactly have passed away. And is that also a factor? And also with the influenza also, it's this thing of they had this fight initially, right? Like whether it's a bacteria or a virus, and then as a result, what do we do? So that might also be
with influenza. One of the things to start this conversation, of course, is how should we see diseases? Joshua Lederberg, who's a Nobel Prize winning molecular biologist, said this very nice thing. He said we now have a good handle on bacterial diseases. but we are still clueless with viruses, which means thanks to antibiotics, we have a much better grip on. So plague, cholera, we are saying are no longer really dangerous, but we still really don't know much about viruses, right? So that's one thing about how do you see the nature of the second thing is, this scientific revolution, right, also kind of got this idea that, we have control over diseases. And just like we said in March 2020, saying, now this time is different, saying now the scientists will come. And of course, they've done great things like the vaccine and so on. But this sense of scientific triumphalism was also there in 1917, 1 year before the flu came, and that kind of completely changed. And you're absolutely right that the flu came and went, and that is really a classic case of herd immunity, in the sense it devastated so many people that, whoever had that immunity basically survived. But the numbers in India, something like 40 to 60% of India, contracted the flu, of which about 10% died. So about 6% of India's population died. These are my estimates on the flu. But what really was this influenza pandemic was reconstructed 80 years later. So it's only in the late 20th century that we understood finally which was the specific organism that caused the 1980s pandemic.
Yeah. And this uncertainty about first of all what is going on and where it's coming from and how to treat it is very fertile ground for rumors to spread. So at that time, like in all the past pandemics, there were rumors that spread, but because it couldn't spread like how it does now, the total volume is lesser, but it persists, right? But now, because you were mentioning all these WhatsApp forwards that you're getting, and the volume of that, do you think that the volume of rumors is just in relation to credible hard science facts is going to have like a cancelling effect, or
I think every pandemic has its share of outright fake news, rumors, and so on. And I document this in the book. For plague, people thought the British were when plague came to India, British had the segregationist policy saying if you have plague, you have to be in the hospital, you can't be at home. And people thought that the British are taking people to extract fluid from their bodies to
or harvest the organs, or
So all sorts of, from the Black Death, they blamed the Jews. There were riots against the Jews during the Black Death. Similarly, I quote Dr. Ambedkar, who in the 1940s was pointing out that a woman was burnt in a village because she was thought to, who belonged to that time called untouchable community, who was burnt in the village because she was thought to have brought cholera to the village. So all sorts of these superstitions kind of existed at that particular point of time. And even now, we saw last year the stuff against the Tablighi Jamaat, a lot of the stuff of this, the idea of the super spreader. It's such an attractive idea, right? Because the thing that pandemics do is that there is no clearly attributable source. So our first response was China. It melded well with this idea of India, China being at loggerheads. So China was the obvious scapegoat. Then once it came within India, new scapegoating, right? So Tablighi Jamaat was seen as the number one reason as to why the virus had spread and so on. And this is we have seen for past pandemics as well. And so obviously what you want is good, smart communication, saying pandemics can start anytime, and you have to take certain measures, certain sensible measures towards curtailing it. Some of the scapegoating of the past in the age of pandemics is against Indian pilgrims. Cholera was seen to be transmitted as a waterborne transmission, and the British blamed the Indian pilgrims. And so they had these horrendous systems, whether you went to Haridwar, whether you went to Puri, whether you went to Mecca as a Muslim. The Indian pilgrim, Hindu or Muslim, became this object of scapegoating. Right? And the pilgrims themselves were saying, look, we've been doing these pilgrims for thousands of years. So clearly this is not us. And of course, so it was very interesting because there was some scientific evidence that this was waterborne, and pilgrim sites could have been important sources of conflict. But it was clear that it was not the pilgrims themselves who were necessarily contributing. And the pilgrims' point was also very fair. They said that, look, you are not providing us the sanitation at the pilgrimage sites. Right? And so there was this interesting back and forth. So broader point being, scapegoating is a very natural point to do in pandemics because there's insecurity and you want to blame someone. And so you blame some classic outsider. So you pick some outsider. It could be the community you don't like, it could be the country you don't like, and so on. And good communication. I saw a lot of politicians in March last year step up and say, this is a virus. the virus does not respect or does not know which religion it is
Discriminate, correct.
and so on. So that's the kind of, so good pandemic management does mean good monitoring of news and basically quickly squashing, fake news. But the fact that this fake news is going to come and spread very fast is a given.
Yeah, that's a good point. And it also sort of boils down to the trust that they have in the trust that the general population has in the government.
Yeah.
So, I mean, like another example that you were giving was in 1896 with that pandemic, you had people blaming the Banya community because of, rats.
Correct.
That could have come. And one, I think it was for smallpox, but one interesting example was, in order that the British government gained the trust of the local population, the Indian Medical Service actually used to employ these Vaidyans or the Ayurvedic doctors to, come on board as a temporary Indian Medical Service staff just to gain the support of, or the credibility of the local population. So, yeah, here all this matters. But so, these past pandemics, they occurred like in a very different environment. Most notably, like influenza occurred while World War was going on, the First World War. So do you think that it's only like a scarcity of resources to beat the bug that, fosters, enmity among countries? Because and the reason I'm asking this is because in 1918, we had this World War going on. And it was also to do with, in 1918, the world was a very different place, right? You have all these imperial powers and fighting for what advance they are going to do in medicine. So like whether the latest medical literature is going to be in German or in French. And that, played out in World War I. But now, we're not really in the middle of a world war, right? So why do we see, China and the US at loggerheads? Everyone is facing the same disease.
Yeah, I think there are two things to be said. One is there are existing fault lines, which the pandemic has kind of sharpened. And that's why you have, Donald Trump was anyway going all out against China. And so, used the pandemic to call it a Chinese virus. Just like how cholera was dubbed as Indian cholera by the Americans and the Europeans. So there's a precedent to that as well. But, Donald Trump really did not get the pandemic at all, as we now know. It's interesting. Donald Trump's political life was cut short by the COVID pandemic, and his grandfather, Frederick Trump's life actually was cut short by the influenza pandemic more than 100 years back. So the Trump family, should really do some homework on pandemics. I think what the pandemic has also shown is remarkable global cooperation, not at the political level, but at the scientific level. Right? The fact that we have a vaccine which has intense amount of collaboration of scientists across countries shows you that the collaboration is happening, right? It might not be happening at the country level, though even there I would say India's vaccine diplomacy, as it's called, is working, I would argue, very well. And the fact that, made in India vaccines are going around the world is a fantastic thing to boost India's image in the world. So I think there are many aspects of the COVID-19 pandemic. What you're pointing out is one thing where certain countries like US, but I would say US and Brazil are probably two countries which completely did not get the pandemic. Right? And so that is why they just kind of went on to their existing division, geopolitical kind of alignment. They just continued, or they blamed many of the things, associated many of the things, like calling the Chinese virus and so on. But for the rest of the world, I think there was some sense of cooperation. The cooperation also meant that you had to shut down international travel. Right? So that was, of course, one thing. You needed coordination for that. So some amount of coordination did exist. And especially for this vaccine, I mean, we should see the vaccine development as a classic case of cooperation. But now the next step is making the vaccine accessible to everyone in the world. And that will require, that as of now, at least I don't see so much of cooperation happening on that. And so that is the next level. And I think a lot of sane voices are emerging saying we need to now start, thinking of how quickly we can vaccinate the entire world and so on. Yeah.
To do that, in your book, you've also said that it's very often things that are not very fancy, like interventions that are not very fancy that can help. So things like just getting nourishing food goes a long way than in, starving, and you've shown some evidence to support that. But do you think that in the previous pandemics you studied, you've shown that we sort of had like a double whammy, right? Where you're being hit by a pandemic and then you also have this food scarcity. And we might have the same problem in India also with vaccines, right? We're giving everybody abroad, or we're giving a lot of people abroad, but we are not, ensuring it for the whole of our population. So, how does this role of artificial scarcity and, like the prioritization there work?
Yeah, so there are two things. One is the food question, one is the vaccine question. One big contextual difference between the age of pandemics, 1817 and 1920, and now is that we are sitting on record high surplus, of food production. Right? So we have these millions of tons of food sitting at the Food Corporation of India. Whereas, as I pointed out in the book, the influenza killed 20 million Indians, a lot because of malnutrition. Right? So influenza worked on a drought, one of India's worst droughts, coincided with 1918. Led to surging food prices, and that argument in my book is that the regional variation of influenza mortality occurred because of that. So we are in a much more comfortable position. So I would say that a lot of people have slid down the income and nutrition ladder over the last 1 year, right? And so that is why one has to be very careful that people are not susceptible to other diseases. So since the overall focus on COVID-19, people could be susceptible to tuberculosis and all these other diseases, which interact especially with lower kind of nutrition levels, but much safer position today than 100 years back. With vaccines, if the question is, should we not be exporting it out and focusing? So there's some trade-off involved, but this is, I think, more of a political decision where you can clearly claim a lot of brownie points by giving a few vaccines to a few countries in Africa, a few countries in Caribbean islands, and so on. So I think this is very smart, diplomacy, and I completely support it. I think once you prioritize the vaccine, because these are small numbers. If you look at percentage of total, it's not like 50% of a vaccine.
Right?
These are really tiny percentages, and I think it's a great what they're doing. Hopefully, it doesn't become like 10%, 20%. I don't think they'll let it go to that much.
Yeah. And also, like, another interesting thing to notice that, at that time you have all these imperial powers that are having more of a say in who gets the treatment, who doesn't get the treatment. But now you have countries like India and also like the vaccine companies themselves having like a huge say in what happens as a consequence, right? So do we see that pandemics actually complicate the relationship? Like in the past, do we see that pandemics complicated the relationship between the colonized and the colonizers and the colonized?
Yeah, I think definitely the colonizers. See, if you look at British rule in India, a huge part of what they're trying to do is keep trade channels open.
Right.
And that really defined, if you compare with the French Empire were much more pro-quarantine than the British Empire. And they kept fighting at all these international issues. I mean, we've started the conversation with WHO. For the listeners, the intellectual history of the WHO goes back to 1851, when the first international conference was held, wired to stop cholera from coming from India. Right? So the roots of WHO also lie in the age of pandemics. And so in those international conferences, sanitary conferences they call, which were held in the late 90s, there were a series of them. Britain and France were constant loggerheads. France sincerely believed in quarantines, what we would today call as lockdowns, small mini scale lockdowns. And the British Empire never, for once, and there's a strong parallel with today's world, the British then was the global hegemon or the global superpower, just like America is today. And it was in the best interest of the British then and Americans now to keep trade open, because these are countries back then and now, which basically supported free trade, laissez-faire kind of economies, at least in the 19th century world and US today. And so in both America and COVID-19 and the British Empire in the late 19th and early 20th century, both were heavily anti-lockdown, right? Why? This economic kind of argument trumped everything else. And that is why I think many more Indians died than was, that they would have in any case, precisely because the British Empire kept these trade channels open at any cost. So there were certain situations where quarantines made more sense, but these ports would not want to quarantine because you would lose economic activity. And this classic sort of trade-off between economic life. But what we do know is that when pandemics did occur, and in those years, the Indian economy was devastated. Right? So this idea that if you don't lock down, you will escape the economic hardship is actually not quite true, because when a pandemic really takes root, you are anyway going to get economic hardship. Why? Because people are so sick that they don't go to work. Classic example, 1918. In fact, I show that, between 1900 and 2020, the worst economic years have been 1918 and 2020. Often people say this 2020 economic contraction of 8% has never happened before. Actually, there was a minus 10% real GDP growth in 1918, 19. Right? So the influenza pandemic also crushed the economy, and there was no lockdown. The trains were moving, but nobody went to work. And so there was a massive supply side shock without a lockdown because of mass mortality. Right? So you can have all kinds of relationship. And in this, the colonizers' relationship with the colonists, I think the best prism to see, because there were many colonizers, not just the British. The colonizers which emphasized free trade at any cost basically did more harm to their subjects than colonizers did. That's one way to see it. But having said that, I show repeatedly there were maybe not too many differences between the British response in India and the response of the princely states, because we have this counterfactual in India. It's not that the British ruled all of India, about 40% of the landmass, 20% of the population was part of the princely states. And so if you see what the Nizam ruled, I show that influenza mortality per capita was arguably higher in what we now call as Rajasthan than the princely states of Rajputana or Nizam ruled Hyderabad than actually many of these British ruled. So there was clearly something beyond colonization per se. And I think it was generally a bad state of nutrition across the subcontinent, whether British rule or not, which kind of led to conditions of higher mortality. And in terms of active management, maybe in certain years, like I point out in 1918, when a little bit of nutrition would have helped, the British were exporting food grains to serve World War I. Right? So that is a classic example of the colonizer not caring about the subjects and caring about their needs. And we see this much later in the Bengal famine as well in 1943. Right? So influenza 1918 exceptional mortality. In the book I do argue that the British do have a role to play. Having said that, you see the counterfactual of princely states in India, and not many of them are doing substantially better. There are a few, like the Travancore Maharaja is fairly forward-looking. The Mysore Maharaja is fairly forward-looking. Visvesvaraya does a great job, and he very quickly realizes that influenza is all about nutrition. That is, if with some nutrition, if you got your meals in a day, you tided the influenza wave slightly. And so in Bangalore and Mysore, they went all out, going to house, ensuring people had got basic kanji, milk, and basic other stuff. And it's a very fascinating manual of good pandemic management. And this is under Visvesvaraya. So you have some examples of Indian administrators doing good. But I think this relationship between the state and the people was always very frictional. And you saw protests in Hyderabad as well. So it's not just that you had protests against the British. Because beyond a point, there was very little with the state of knowledge back then of what the state could actually
do. And this is also to do with the treatment, right? To deal with the current COVID crisis, we have in effect this Epidemics Act of 1897, right? Do we see that particular act? I mean, and there's a lot of arguments, of course, that it's too outdated to waive all those things today. But do we see because the princely states did the princely states not have this act in effect, and that maybe gave them more leeway about how they should manage the pandemic?
Not really. I think the Epidemic Disease Act or variants of it were quickly lapped up even in the princely states because they had this British advisor. It's an act, of course, which gives outside powers, very, very large powers to police. We saw last year it being misused in many situations across the 20th century, being misused. There's no doubt that you do need some laws in place, because as we saw last year, like in the US, nobody's wearing masks. Right? How do you enforce this? So you have to have police enforcing it. So the fact that some laws, some emergency kind of laws need to be there, I think nobody really denies that. But I do think the Epidemic Disease Act does need a relook. I think some of the powers given are excessive. And I think one of the things that should come out for COVID-19 is to look at administrators' response and see how to reform this particular act, because it really has not been changed much since since its emergence in the age of pandemics. It comes about in 1997 when plague breaks out. And it's interesting, the law was very hurriedly cobbled up literally within a few days.
Is it purposely broad? That's what I'm asking. Because you have they sort of knew that other different diseases are going to come. So was it purposely made broad, or
the objective was to protect Europe from plague? Right? I mean, this is the idea. They said we should do everything in our power to use surveillance measures in India such that plague does not hit Europe. That's the foundational objective, if not written. That was the emergency. The backdrop of the Epidemic Disease Act is that as plague starts rising in India between, say, roughly October 1896 and February 1897, it comes about in the first half of 1897, the law. Britain is under attack from Europe, that is France and other powers, saying do something, right? Because we have the memory of the Black Death, right? So plague has struck India, it struck Bombay, Bombay is a huge commercial port, trading with Europe at that time. And it's in that context that Britain is under pressure to do something, and they hurriedly then convene those international sanitary conferences. And it's in that background that Britain has to show that they're doing something. And so literally within a few days, this act is cobbled out. And we are still using that today. So not really much thought was gone into its creation. But it's a convenient tool. It gives the government sweeping powers. That's the best thing any government would want during a pandemic.
Correct. And so, these things, basic things like nutrition and also wearing masks. And I remember when there was this thing in 1918 called the influenza jacket, and lockdowns, lockups, all these things, right? These can be categorized as non-pharmaceutical interventions that happen when, we really don't know what to do yet. So given that all of this, used to happen before, why didn't we have a standard operating procedure ready when COVID struck? Like, why are we still debating whether wearing the mask is effective or not?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of studies, good studies now, which show that the mask is effective. But see, at the onset of any pandemic, there's going to be a lot of uncertainty. Last year, a lot of us were obsessed about surface transmission. Today, the empirical studies show that maybe that's not so important, right? And so suddenly this whole thing many of the things we did last year, grocery bag, be very careful on grocery bags and all. It turns out on hindsight, it's not. For example, the cover of my book is this, I don't know if you can see it. It's this, it's like this emergency operation in Bombay city during the plague. And it shows like literally a fire engine and people are flushing, there's this thing out here, this flushing kind of engine, which is pouring water on a building. Now that's not, they're pouring disinfectants on a building. Yeah. Now they thought that if you pour disinfectants, you can, get rid of plague.
Kill all the germs, yeah.
And this is really not how plague has ever been, eradicated. So there are obviously a lot of quick solutions which people think based on how one thinks. So there is a lot of uncertainty on transmission, on how the disease works, and hence there's a lot of uncertainty on what to do. But the thing is, you have to do something, right? And there is also a psychological thing out here, that is the state has to convey that we're doing something. Right? And so please take certain precautions. So in the world of cholera, we had cholera belts. In the world of plague, you had these kind of disinfectants. There's a photograph of a person being scrubbed clean and so on. Just like we saw last year, migrants being washed down. And in the end, they realized it was about plagues, rats and rat fleas and human beings. Right? So in a way, on even COVID-19, we are kind of in the world of ignorance. We still don't know much about COVID-19. We're still in the world of ignorance. I see ourselves like how the world was between 1897 and 1905, obsessed about plague, all sorts of theories. The reigning theory then was plague is because of poisonous air coming from soil, right? Because they realized it was happening only at the houses. It was not happening in certain houses. Why were mud-based houses having more plague than brick-based houses? And so the reigning idea, remember, this is a world where the germ-based theory is still not well established. People still believe in the old idea of miasma or air-based pollution, driving disease. And so plague is considered to be because of poisonous gases coming from the soil. And it's only in 1905, after a beautiful paper written in the Indian Medical Gazette by a Secunderabad-born member of the Indian Medical Service, a guy called Liston. He basically publishes a paper called Plague, Rats and Fleas. And very systematic observation says that, look, this is how. So then there's international collaboration to test this guy's ideas. And over the next 5 years, they conclusively established this link. And then the whole movement on plague is no longer on disinfectants, no longer on flushing houses. It took 10 years for them for this paradigm to shift. It completely moved towards rat-proofing houses. Right? And that's why cantonments rarely got plague. Cantonments had good pakka structures, but mud houses never had. And across the world, in Indonesia, in India, suddenly the whole obsession was on either catching rats or on building better houses. But the British never. Yeah, but the British never really considered, investing in good quality housing. So they went for this catching rats method. Some of it still exists, by the way. In the book I mentioned, the going rate to kill a rat even today in Bombay is about 18 rupees per rat. So this whole rat catching profession really starts, roughly then. But the point is, it kind of happens over the course of the pandemic. With more knowledge, older hypotheses are discarded and then new information comes. I see a question by Pallavi on regional variation of mortality. So when we come to that question, I'll talk more about this.
Sure. And the similar debate had also gone on about the cause of cholera, right? And then when John Snow published his finding about the Broad Street pump, that was also ridiculed at that time by a lot of people, not by everybody, but still by a lot of people. But my question here is, it's a very simple thing he's suggesting, right? Just improve the sewerage system. So whether or not cholera was a waterborne disease, wouldn't it have just been a good idea? Like at that time, public health is influenced by these Victorian ideals of sanity rather than the cause, right? So is it that it was just too costly if it's not the exact cause?
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing that cholera mortality started falling in North America and Western Europe in the late 19th century, the minute they started investing in good water treatment systems in their cities.
Correct.
But the same never really happened. They did introduce it in Calcutta in 1869, and cholera mortality actually started falling. Right. But interestingly, and this is because John Snow, as you said, established this waterborne transmission. But the fact is, the Indian medical service officers in India never bought this waterborne transmission theory because their pet theory was the airborne transmission. And for 40 years, the Indian medical service officers stubbornly refused to believe their own person, that John Snow is their own guy, in the sense of being British, but they refused to believe, they prefer to believe a guy, the German physician called Pettenkofer. And Pettenkofer would ridicule, cholera and all the germ-based ideas. He was so steep in this airborne. So we're talking about a clash of two different scientific paradigms. Right. And the Indian medical officers who are British chose this, on hindsight, the wrong view. And for 40 years, we could have easily not had those, major cholera outbreaks in the late 19th century, if only we got, piped water supply. But that remained, a pipe dream. Having said that, I point out in the book an amazing example of how this water-based transmission was linked in India. So a guy called MC Ferdinand, an Indian medical service officer, was kind of convinced of John Snow's idea. And so I showed this map in the book. He shows the map of a village. One side of a street is where the upper ranking castes stay. The other side is the lower ranking caste. And he's using this caste level variation to show this waterborne transmission, because he says that there were two wells in the village and they were used only by the upper ranking caste. And it so happened that those wells were contaminated. And in that village, in that particular village, only the upper ranking caste actually suffered from cholera. And the one person who suffered from the lower ranking caste happened to be the washerman of this upper ranking caste settlement. And so he's like, this is a waterborne theory, and why are my seniors not accepting this? Right. It's a remarkable case, and by some accounts, he loses his job. So strong is the scientific paradigm. So India is really kind of unlucky that we got medical officers. We got some brilliant medical officers later. We got guys like Ronald Ross, who won a Nobel Prize for discovering the malaria mosquito link. We got Leonard Rogers, Leonard Rogers is a guy who invents this intravenous treatment. So he basically cuts down case fatality rates of cholera from 50% to somewhere around 10%. So he's a genius, but he salvages the reputation of the Indian medical service. Before that, there was a time when the whole world had moved on to the waterborne transmission theory, and it's only these a few Indian medical service officers who said, no, cholera is airborne. So it's an interesting tussle which happened in the late 19th century on major scientific paradigms.
Okay. So, for the period under your study, we are still under British rule. And of course, you've made this point that 40% of the country was under princely rule. But what does what the Indian medical service have to say? I mean, what is the effect of that on the regional variation that we are seeing in the country? Like, are we saying that maybe if the Indian medical service had more authority in one area, the cases go down? I mean, you've had some very interesting findings with regard to that.
I think, each disease is very unique in terms of its ecology and so on. But again, just like, in Calcutta and Madras, the municipal officials were very happy that they were not getting battered by plague. And they were celebrating, just like many states in India are celebrating that, this COVID-19 is harmless. Calcutta and Madras were celebrating this. Now, it turns out that plague took root in certain parts of India because of the nature of rats and the nature of rat fleas. There are particular rats and particular rat fleas which are efficient transmitters of plague. And those rats and rat fleas were not really found in Calcutta and Madras. So it had nothing to do with pandemic management. It was just about the disease ecology. And that is why, one has to be very careful in outlining regional variation mortality. Because 5 years down the line, we might uncover the true nature of COVID-19 and we'll be in a much better position to explain the regional variations that we see across the world, across India, and so on. So we have, of course, we need to generate hypotheses. We have this hygiene hypothesis, or what I call the Pani Puri hypothesis. The more you eat Pani Puri, the more strength and immunity you get, and so on. But really, there's no conclusive evidence as of now of pretty much anything. The only thing we know is COVID-19, with a lot of certainty now, is COVID-19 hits old people much more than young people. I mean, there's a clear age gradient, and the most recent studies are showing a very close tight link with obesity. COVID-19 is the risk factor with obesity is just tremendously high, right? So these are the two core factors which the scientific community has some consensus on, based on studies done in a variety of countries. But beyond that, a lot of it is just
speculation. Yeah, sure. Yeah, and I mean, now once this has happened, I mean, now that this has happened, we see that it's likely more pandemics are likely to happen. This phenomenon of recurring pandemics, given also because the buffer between human life and wildlife is slowly disappearing, right? So what do you think, if that's the case, I mean, what do you think we should do? And also, and this might relate also to your studies in migration, that do you think that maybe combating or trying to minimize the harmful effects of climate change might be striking at the root?
Yeah, I'm very skeptical of the broader links of what, is there a way to stop pandemics completely? The approach I take in my book is that pandemics can never be eradicated, but they can be curtailed. Right. Which means it's not something like polio, we are saying, is pretty much out of our we've eradicated polio, we've eradicated smallpox, right. But we are not going to be able to eradicate pandemics, because as Joshua Lederberg says, pandemics as a kind of event are evolutionary phenomenon themselves. There's a constant evolutionary kind of interplay between organisms and human beings, animals, etc. So we are never, just to give you a sense, Black Death happened at a time when there was very little globalization, at a time when we are saying there was no climate change, and yet 1/3 of Europe perished. Right? So I don't really see, how, I mean, there's a lot. If you look at the history of pandemics, I think they are so kind of, it has happened at very different time periods. I don't think we should be attributing some of these, bigger things like, say, human-induced climate change on this. Whatever little information we have, for example, transfer in wet markets. So China is now going to be much more vigilant on, wet markets and so on. So in India, the pilgrims were under attack. So there was some investment in vaccinating pilgrims. In the Kumbh Mela, for example, in the 1930s, it was compulsory for people to vaccinate themselves against cholera before going for Kumbh pilgrims. So to the extent that you might think that certain things work, those efforts, I think, should be taken. But broadly, I don't think, or even this idea that pandemics will become more frequent going forward, I think what history tells you is it can happen anytime. Yeah, I mean, it can happen tomorrow. The next pandemic might come 200 years later. Right? We really don't know. And it's a lot about this, evolutionary logic of these organisms, which have made us human beings over millions of years and so on. Right? So there's a lot of uncertainty, and history is important because there are certain things which are repeated, as I pointed in my book. If you look at these episodes, there seem to be 4 clear stages of a pandemic. Right? Okay. First is denial. So so when, like, March last year, the whole world was in denial mode. Let's say February last year, nothing can happen to us, or pandemics, because we had swine flu, nothing happened to us. There was SARS, nothing happened to us. So that's sort of a denial. Second is confusion. Right? So from denial, you go to confusion. Then this was like last year, March to May. And then there is acceptance that, this is something which is happening to us. But the 4th stage is most important, and that is erasure. Right? Okay. And the more you erase, the more you deny the next time around. Right? And that is why I've written this book. That is, we should not be, the memory of this pandemic should not be eroded. So we think COVID-19, this 2020 year, we will never forget this, right? But we will all die. And that is why we need to document what happens in 2020. And we need to have government task force report. Because for all their faults, the British were very good at documentation. A lot of the stuff, plague was defeated because of a series of plague commission reports written over 10 years.
Correct.
And that is the kind of thing, cumulative knowledge, which eventually ends particular pandemics. And that is why, I think we should do much better job at documentation, so that the next, because if you see some of the countries which responded very well, Vietnam, even China to a certain extent, Taiwan, they were all hit by recent pandemics. The memory of countering them was very strong. Kerala went into overdrive mode because they had the Nipah virus outbreak 2 years back. Right? So the more recently you're hit, the more responsive you're going to be to the next time around. And that's why Western Europe and North America, whose last major pandemic was 1980, right? Like in India, I mean, you can count the HIV as a pandemic. And that's why even much of Africa was, well prepared, Ebola and so on. But Western Europe, North America, have the last pandemic they saw was 1918. And so their response was, they were quite delayed. And even there, the history textbooks don't really talk much about 1980. They talk about Black Death, but not so much about
influenza. Yeah, that's a really good point, which I think George Bernard Shaw also holds. He said, if history repeats itself and the unexpected always happens, how incapable must man be of learning from inexperience? So I think that maybe because of the internet and all these lived experiences that we've had, COVID-19 seems to be quite well documented, and it's hopefully something that continues on to the next generation. And it informs future policy. But for those in the audience, if other than your book and the bibliography in your book, are there any other resources that the audience members can look at?
Yeah, I have so this is a book which which has come out with HarperCollins, but associated with the book is a 90-page document, which is a statistical and bibliographic appendix to the book. And this has come out as a working paper, which is freely available online. It's called Pandemics and Historical Mortality in India. I have a Google site. If you go there, I have a tab for pandemics. And there actually I've listed down all the resources. I have my working paper. And that statistical appendix, by the way, has all the time series charts, the maps, the regional variations, and everything. It also has the bibliography of more than 300 studies. But it also has resources. There's a great podcast called The Infectious Historians, which is very, very interesting podcast on pandemics of the past. vox.eu is a great resource. If you're a student of economics, how a pandemic is affecting economics, they have a series of articles there. So vox.eu, vox.eu is a great resource. If you want to read books, Madhukar Pai has a lovely curated list of, I think about 200 books on global health. So if you want to read books on global health, that's a great list to go through. So go to Madhukar Pai's list of these books. I'll be offering this course called Pandemics next sem. So if you're interested to audit it, maybe ask your professor, how can you do this at IIM Ahmedabad? I actually teach a course called Pandemics now at IIMA, and we had a great take up, this sem, where we try and connect pandemics with business and the economy. 5 sessions of the course are on the past, 5 sessions of the course on COVID-19, and you can write an essay on either the past or the present, and that turned out to be really fun. So in different ways, I think one can learn a lot.
Sure. And then there's also a few good newsletters that have come out. There's one called Anticipating the Unintended, which has come out with a lot of nice ideas. And also The Economist's new newsletter called Simply Science, which is very well informed. It keeps everyone very well informed about the developments. Very interestingly also, before we open to audience questions, there is on the centenary of the Spanish flu, the BBC 4 actually did this documentary called Contagion, where they made people in the UK download an app called Pandemics and track their movements for a day. And then based on that, they did a model of if we had another pandemic, what would the spread look like? So if you want to get a sense of how this modeling and all works, that's a nice place to start. And also, I was just also seeing that in popular culture, all these movies like My Fair Lady has Audrey Hepburn saying, oh, my relatives died due to the influenza, and even Yeah. So
Yeah.
as we become more abreast about what has happened in the past, we tend to notice things in our daily life.
As my son pointed out, Tintin. My son is a big Tintin fan. Tintin and the Picaros also mentions influenza. So it's a remarkable sort of. So it has entered popular culture.
Right. So
Okay,
yeah.
sorry to be a spoil sport. This is so mesmerizing. We would never want to stop listening to the two of you on such an interesting topic. But as you would be seeing, dozens of questions are pouring in. So let's give some good time to the questions.
Sure. Sorry.
As you catch up, Chinmay and Asha, if you catch up on your chat and see if any questions pop up as interesting, we'll come to those. But before that, maybe let's get one or two people up on camera to ask their questions or make their comments. You already referred to Pallavi's question, Chinmay. So Professor Pallavi, are you around? Can you come on camera and ask your question, please?
Yes, I am around. Unlike many of our students who are not when we when we cold call them. Yeah, so I think you already read the question, Chinmay. So it's just just wondering whether that there could be any kind of immunity that developed from the past in the Indian population.
That's so it's not actually, you say, I'm going out on a limb, but actually it's a very fair question to ask, because there are good studies on past immunity helping you get through this. I would just say that the nature of the virus is quite different, at least what the scientists say. So the structure of influenza and the structure of coronavirus is quite different. So even if you had, in theory, immunity against H1N1A, which was 1918, there's no guarantee that you could get immunity against this. But this is a very important thing about regional variations and stuff like that. I should just point out there have been studies on the long-term effects of the 1918 pandemic. For example, there's a study in the US which says that in utero exposure. So if you were if you were born in 1918-19 and you were during this wave, suppose between August and December 1918, if you were in a womb, what were your lifetime outcomes, right? Because these are families which were exposed and so on. And so there are very interesting studies like that. Now people have used the demographic health surveys across countries, and they've seen the cohort which was born in 1918, 19. So all sorts of interesting health economics work has happened. So there's some work which suggests that for US, actually those kids had worse outcomes, many, if you count them in the 1970s data and so on. But there was a literature survey which said that they looked at 80 demographic health surveys across different countries, and they find no real long-term effects. So were the health advantages and so on from the 19? So what I'm trying to say is there actually have been studies precisely asking this question. And the meta review of this suggests that not really. I mean, there's no statistically significant kind of evidence to suggest that exposure had anything. In India, the few studies on influenza, one is a working paper by Vishnupriya Gupta and others. What happened to female workforce participation? That is very interesting. They say that it actually goes up because a lot of women died and a lot of pregnant mothers died. But it goes up by 1921 if you look at the census, but then it again restabilizes to kind of lower level by 1931. Fertility drops tremendously in initial terms, but then again starts going up. Could there be, so just to point out, there was 1918, but there was also a flu pandemic in 1957 and 1968. Again, India was not hit too much, but about 1 million people died in the world, most of them in East Asia. So there is an argument that maybe repeated flu attacks in East Asia is giving some immunity out there. But again, I think the big thing is that the difference between the influenza structure and the coronavirus structure, it seems very unlikely that you could be accorded immunity. And this thing on regional variation, is something about North India and so on. As you know, the classic three reasons now to explain regional variation. One is reporting errors. I don't think that's a big deal. Second is demographic structure, older societies more. And third is, of course, this, India immunity, innate immunity. But of course, nobody really knows what aspect of that immunity. Is it the Pani Puri hypothesis that, because we're eating on the streets that, we have some great immunity? I don't think that is the case. I think this new line of research on obesity is very promising, right? Because that really explains the cross-country variation very well. It explains why cities which are usually have higher obesity rates. What we know is that COVID mortality is very well correlated with urban densities. Right? In India also, a few metros account for the bulk of the mortality. Right? So what is it about metros or what is it about urbanized places which is having higher mortality? So I think there's still a lot of mysteries, and I think we'll really get to know only a few years down the line what is explaining. But I don't think there's substantial north-south difference in terms of response to COVID mortality. I was in Bihar, by the way, just a few weeks back, and Bihar, the per capita numbers are negligible, and they are very proud of it. Saying this is great, but it's the health system in Bihar is in shambles. The overall malnutrition levels are very high. In fact, if you look at overall death rates, they're quite stark. So I mean, there's nothing to be really proud about out there. And this larger question comes: if you're immune against COVID, why are you not immune to tuberculosis and so many other diseases, where also India is slightly higher than the global norm on case fatality? So there are a lot of questions to be asked on overall immunity. There could be some aspects, what scientists call as cross-reactive immunity, which link it with COVID. But I still think it's too early in the day to kind of pinpoint. And as I pointed out, plague, the officials in Calcutta and Madras were saying, we've done a great job on plague. But the fact is that, there was no way they could have got plague in large numbers because they didn't have the rats and the rat fleas, which mattered for plague. So if we take obesity as the answer for COVID-19, hypothetically, we'd say there's no way that Bihar can have this because Bihar's obesity rates, it's on the other end of undernutrition. They have a very, very thin percentage of overnutrition in India. So I think this is the way, I think one should look at this question of regional mortality, which is of course very fascinating. All of us are, I think, obsessed about why some parts are, more hit than others. I think Siddharth Mukherjee has a great piece in the New Yorker, looking at many of these things.
Hi, thanks Pallavi for the question, and thanks Chinmay. Another eminent MA economics student, Lucky Pandey, you said you have a question which you can come on camera and ask the speakers. Lucky, are you there?
Yeah, can you hear me, sir?
Yeah.
Yes, hi Lucky.
Yes, sir. Hello, sir. Sir, I have just two short questions. First, why is it difficult for scientists and historians to determine where the virus was originated? And the second is, once the pandemic started, can it be contained forever? Yeah, thank you, sir.
Yeah, so like, for example, we say that, as I said, we are not really scared about cholera and plague anymore. I mean, just think of plague. Plague has terrorized civilizations for at least 2 millennia that we are aware of, right? Because we're saying 6th century, 14th century, 19th century, and so on. And yet plague today, while it's there in Madagascar and a few places, it is no longer seen anymore as a pandemic, right? In the sense that we have now mastered plague to a certain extent. So the second part is that, yes, it is in theory possible that we do master, like polio, smallpox, a lot of things are not there with us anymore. Right? And so that is completely possible. And it could be the case that coronavirus will be, eradicated in a few decades down the line. But there's of course a time lag involved. It's very rare that within 6 months, you'll master the thing and can eradicate it. But the larger thing is there will constantly be new threats. And that is what history shows us, that there will never be like a complete equilibrium. The equilibrium is that new organisms will come, right? And so that is why as I say, you can never eradicate pandemics. You can only try and curtail them. The first part of the question is, source. It's actually very tough in history. Black Death, where did it start? Only competing kind of thing. Some people say, Europeans have always said China. And China is the source of all pandemics. Cholera was always seen to be India. For this, we are saying Wuhan, because it seems to be the most likely source for it. Now, where within Wuhan, the Chinese have something, the WHO has certain things. But we can be, fairly assured on COVID-19 that this is, Wuhan. Now, you could say that actually not Wuhan. It's somewhere, 100 kilometers away from Wuhan. But at least in the overall landscape of the world, we are zeroing down on a particular, coordinate, which is fairly small. I'll give you the example of cholera. Cholera started off in Eastern India, but it then became a disease which every time, so example, 1866, it devastated New York City, and they blamed India for it. Right? Now, actually, new research is showing that earlier historians in the late 19th and early 20s, they maintained that every time cholera hit, it was coming from India. But what now people are showing is that you can't really trace everything to India. Cholera did become endemic in certain parts of the world and then kind of struck from there. So there's a very good paper on Japan, which was actually much of what historians said it was attacking Japan in the 19th century from the ships that would come from Calcutta would take it to Japan. They're now saying that no, it was in the waters. Cholera we now know works in certain marine systems. It was along the eastern Bay of Bengal system. For example, Punjab rarely had cholera. Along the Indus, you rarely had cholera, right? But along the Bay of Bengal waters that sustain this cholera bacteria. So certain water systems sustain cholera, the Vibrio, the bacteria, and hence those regions got more of those things. So was the source of the outbreak in 1866 in New York from India, or was the source from something much more localized? Is a question historians are now asking. And how do you see that? All we can say is that before 1817, there's no real evidence that cholera went around the world very quickly. And so there seems to be some strain mutation. That's the most accepted theory, which kind of happens in 1817, which kind of starts it making it a very deadly disease. So it is hard to pinpoint the source in history. All one can do is try and read through what people of those times were saying, and critically, all historians have to be very critical in their reading of those sources. But on COVID-19, we are saying Wuhan as the most accepted source, and the Chinese themselves say that. So it's very, very clear on that. I'll just end this. In my last chapter of the book starts with a quote from the Arthashastra, right? And so the Arthashastra, as you know, is a famous treatise in Indian statecraft. But it's amazing that the Arthashastra has certain injunctions on epidemiology or medical systems, basically. So this is a quote from the Arthashastra, it translated in English. It says, any doctor who is called to a house to treat a severely wounded person or one suffering from unwholesome food or drink shall report the fact to the Gopa and the Sthanika. If he makes a report, he shall not be accused of any crime. If he does not, he shall be charged with the same offense. Right? So what the Arthashastra is saying is that you better take ground level medical information very seriously, and you don't try and hide it, which means you can identify the source very quickly. Right? So it's interesting how some of these things have really large historical precedents.
Hi. Thanks, Lucky. Thanks, Chinmay again. Amol, as usual, has some very interesting ideas and questions. So, Professor Amol Agarwal of our university, would you be able to come on and ask some questions? Yep, Amol is coming on, I hope. Yes, you are there. We can't hear you, Amol, but I can't hear you at least. You can hear Amol? Chinmay?
I can't hear now.
Amol, your audio is not working.
I can see some of his questions. I can try.
Okay, yeah, maybe we'll just.
So so one question, and this is referring to Sudhir's question as well. So how did Ahmedabad respond during the past pandemics, and more broadly, how does it compare with today? So one thing is, whenever you see the performance, and how do you judge performance? Right? That is one thing. Like as I said, Madras never really had the plague. Did it perform well? Well, if you take plague mortality per capita as a metric, Madras performed exceptionally well, right? But as I said, it was not management. They just got lucky in the sense that the disease ecology of plague was very different. So one has to be very careful between performance versus non-performance related, factors. But in the 1918, so let me start with plague first. Sardar Patel's, political journey, in fact, starts from the plague. He was a member of the sanitation committee in Ahmedabad municipality. That's the first major thing he did. While a lot of committee members from the Ahmedabad municipality were actually fleeing, when plague finally struck Ahmedabad with a lot of force in 1917, 1 year before the flu, basically Sardar Patel went around trying to do a lot of relief work and so on, and is highly praised for that. So that's of course the rise of Sardar Patel. So that's a famous story from Ahmedabad's history about how a plague pandemic launched Patel's career. 1918 was really terrible for everybody. I mean, in mortality, mainly Western and Northern India. But as I said, incidence rates were fairly high across India. So whether you were in Assam or Madras or Delhi or in Bombay, the chances of getting the flu was quite high. But what's interesting is Western India was unusually hit because of the drought. The monsoon failed, and that's why there was unusually large amount of distress. There are news about trains coming to Gujarat with dead bodies from Bombay, all sorts of horror stories. In this, the Ahmedabad municipality back then was actually particularly criticized for not opening up certain institutions as public hospitals. So that's the one incidence that we get. How do we know this? We know this from newspaper reports. So you have, particular, I think the Praja Sabha and particular newspaper reports from those times, which kind of convey this. Mridula Ramana has written a lovely piece on, Ahmedabad, Bombay, and so on. So that's the reference if you want to know more about Ahmedabad. But 1918 flu, very, very shortly, Ahmedabad was seen to be a city where it was not quite managed well. The people who stepped in were the merchant associations, not the municipality. The people who stepped in were also the missionary associations who did a lot of relief work. So in a way, the age of pandemics, the government capacity across India was stretched out. It was very meager, and civil society had to step up. Right? And just as we saw it last year as well. And so that's precisely what happened in Ahmedabad. I should also tell you that Mahatma Gandhi lost a member of his family. He was in the ashram at that time, and he lost a member of his family. And the most affected part of Gujarat is this district which we would now call as Dangs, right, which is a tribal-dominated district in southern Gujarat. And by some estimates, 15 to 20% of the population got knocked out. Knocked out meaning died. Right? And there are David Hardiman tells us that of stories of basically corpses being thrown off the cliffs of the hills and so on because of such amount of mass mortality. So huge impact on Gujarat, but Ahmedabad in particular is seen as mismanagement. The comparison with today is kind of a bit unfair. It depends on how you see today's response, whether it was good or bad. I do think they were very different sets. I think the 1980 in particular, the mortality numbers were just staggering. Right? And so really there's no comparison between that and today in terms of mortality. To give you some context, today we are saying COVID-19 has claimed about 150,000 odd lives in India. If you don't, if let's forget underreporting and so on, there were 200,000 people dying every single day in November 1980. Right? So every single day, 200,000 Indians were dying on the overall population base, which was about 1/4 of what we are, because there are only about 300 million Indians. Right? So the kind of terror of mass mortality was just immense. You have stories of in the Ganga, corpses, piling and choking the Ganga at certain places. Just completely, a health crisis of a completely different proportion happening in 1980. So I don't think it's very fair to compare the 1918 kind of response with today's thing.
Yeah, and it also has something to do with, because at that time we were under British rule, and now, of course, we have our own federal structure. And so that also is a response that we have. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
So Chinmay, we had requested your time until 5:30, so we have taken more than that time. But if you have a few more minutes, and if you see any interesting questions, we have the time. If you have the time.
Sure, I have about 10 minutes, so I'll just quickly go through some of the questions. Was the 1918 pandemic forgotten because World War I happened? Definitely, World War I is more remembered than the flu pandemic, so that's definitely one of the contexts. And remember, in 1918, the first part of 1918, the news about the flu was actively suppressed by America, Britain. That's why we call it the Spanish flu and not the American flu, because Spain had a relatively free press back then. So obviously, the World War I is an important part, and we remember World War I, right? Even in India, nobody really remembers this thing. But I would say in India, there's an added thing. It's the freedom movement. Right? And one of the things I'm arguing in the book is you can look at India's freedom movement through the prism of pandemics. 1857 uprising, I never knew before writing this book, happened on the back of a major cholera outbreak. In fact, there's a study which shows garrison towns which are more exposed to cholera saw more mutiny rates. Right? So there's a clear link between the epidemic and the revolt in 1857. This is cholera. Between 1896 and about 1915s, you can't understand the rise of people like Patel, people like Gokhale, people like Tilak, without understanding their role in managing or contesting the surveillance imposed during the plague pandemic. The peak year of plague mortality, 1907, where 1 million Indians died due to plague, that is also the year of the Congress split between the moderates and the extremists. And a lot of their concerns about what do we do with the plague. And then 1819, the influenza year, is really the year where Gandhi comes to fore. Right? And we've completely forgotten about this subtext on how Gandhi comes to the fore. 20 million Indians are dead. You can imagine the amount of mass misery, which kind of, people are looking for new leadership, and Gandhi provides that. So in a way, you can actually look at key markers of India's freedom movement: 1857, rise of the Congress, and rise of Gandhi through the prism of cholera, plague, and influenza. So it's a neat way of connecting pandemics and the political movements of those times. So Sachinan's question on, with the wisdom of hindsight, how well did India fare on the front of curtailing the spread of COVID-19? I think it's fair to say that if you look at the seroprevalence numbers, the latest number by the ICMR is about 22%. In urban India, it is about 30%, which means 1 in 3 Indians have COVID-19, right? So, or had an exposure to COVID-19. So I don't think we've been very successful in curtailing spread. Okay, I mean, if you see the packed stadiums, if you see the packed political rallies, there is really no way that the viruses go active. We have in a way been lucky that the case fatality rates have been lower than in the Western world, right? And we have been lucky that it has really not bitten us as much as in the West. But I don't think we've been very successful in curtailing. Having said that, if you look at the performance, a lot of people want to know, where does India lie? Now, if you look at the economic survey document, it would seem that India has done the best. That's the government document. It compares India against 19 other countries who have done worse than us. Worse on what? Mortality per capita, which means US, Brazil, and so on. But any rational understanding would compare India with about all the countries of the world. So you have 200 odd countries. So 2 metrics: economic contraction and COVID-19 mortality per capita. India is on the bottom half on both. Okay, on economic contraction, we are on the complete bottom end. We are one of the worst performing economies in 2020. But on COVID mortality per capita, we are doing better than US, but we are still not in the top half of these 200 countries. Right? So overall, I would say our performance has been in the middle of the round. Right? It's not been great, and it's not been spectacularly bad. This is how I see India's performance in terms of the pure metrics. So that's how I would see how successful India has been. But I think the greatest success has been now the vaccine. Right? No other kind of developing country has this vaccine production capability like India has. And so that's a fantastic thing that India is doing. So very, very happy that this vaccine thing has taken off. There's a question by Sudhir again, which pandemic comes close out of these 3 to COVID-19, cholera, plague, or influenza? Cholera and plague were bacteria. This influenza was virus. So in terms of the properties, this is of course like 1918. You'll see the waves, right? And the waves there were 2 waves in the 1918 one. We were already now in the second wave out here. But what is really crucial to know if there's seasonality, right? Because we've seen that now the pickup is happening precisely at the time it happened last year in India, right? And the pickup, I mean, we don't know if there is seasonality. We'll get to know the seasonality only by the end of this year. But cholera and plague were highly seasonal diseases, right? People knew when plague came and went. By the time May finished, people knew plague was gone. And the reason we found later was, in the monsoon, these rat fleas are kind of not very, active. And so those flea bites never came. Right? So like you have malaria seasons because the mosquitoes are very active in certain seasons. So is there a seasonality to COVID-19? We still don't know enough. Right? But if it happens, then it would mimic cholera and plague, very strong. In terms of response surveillance, this is very similar to the plague, right? And we're using the same act, the Epidemic Disease Act. So I think on certain different things, I think it kind of mimics these 3 pandemics in very different ways. There's RG Shah's question: how can India go about forming policy and a document for handling pandemics? Now, this is one is of course the epidemiologist, prescriptions. I'm not one, so I'm not going to answer that. But I have worked on migration for 10 years. So I'm going to very specifically answer this question on what can we do for migration or migrant workers. I think we failed. So that's one thing we failed spectacularly. I think there's a wide acceptance. The fact that India was probably the only country where you had literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people walking back home was quite a terrible thing to happen last year. And as we saw in the poll, there were basically 2 options most people ticked. One was, should the government have let people go home first? Or should the government have kept people there and given them free food? And ideally, we should do both. In my view, we should have done both. We should have given the option for people to go back, because what the history of migration and pandemics tells us is that health crisis is people get panicked and want to be with their family back home, right? And so what was heard in Victoria Terminus in 1897 during the plague pandemic, as people were trying to go back home, was this particular line: agar marna hai to gaon mein marenge, right? And this is exactly what we heard last year, 1897, what was documented then and even last year. So there's the need to go home is going to be very strong. And while you can curtail international migration, you simply cannot curtail internal migration in the same way. You can't just switch. You can switch off airports. You can't switch off state borders. Why? Because people walk to the state borders, walk a few kilometers down, cross it, and continue to walk. Right? So you can't really walk from London to Bombay, but you can walk from Bombay to Patna. Right? So that's a theoretical possibility. So the British, in fact, were considering whether to shut down the railways or not back then. And they said we should not shut down the railways because people will anyway walk back. Right? The Chinese shut down the railways in 1911, just like us in 1911 for countering the plague. And as it turned out, a lot of people walked back home and died in the winter. It was January 1911, very cold and so on. So clamp down by closing the railways, often you can generate a humanitarian crisis, very different from the pandemic crisis. And that's why I think on March 15th last year, we did have 1 week or so to allow our migrant workers to go back home, and that should have been done. The reason why you need to send back workers home first is because you don't know how long the lockdown is going to last. That is what happened last year. You don't know how credible. There were some migrant workers who said, yes, okay, we will stay here. You have told us 3 weeks, we'll stay here for 3 weeks. But you saw what happened after that. After 3 weeks, it became one additional week, then an additional week. So once that happens, you can't squash a pandemic in 3 weeks. It's as simple as that. So it makes more sense to actually give people the bandwidth to go home and then clamp the lockdown. Right? So there are very good, solid reasons, I believe, that one should allow migrant workers to go. The UK government, for instance, allowed students, international students, to go back home. They gave them 1 week and said, then we will shut down. Even we, by the way, shut down our airspace in a very calibrated manner between March 16th and March 24th last year. Right? But the migrant workers got only 4 hours notice. So there's, I think, a strong case in future pandemic management to take in migrant workers as high priority population and ensure both, that is, migrant workers who want to go back home, give them the option, internal migrant workers, and at the same time, give free food, free everything for at least a couple of months in our cities, so that people who can't go back or don't want to go back do have a social security kind of lifeline in the city. So I would have to take both options, on that board. But this thing that nothing can be done is clearly not acceptable, because you have to ask, why did no other country get this migration crisis? If every country in the world did lockdown, why did only we get the migration crisis? It's because we shut down the railways, nobody else did. And so that was the key difference.
Maybe if you have a minute, Chinmay, before you go, yeah. One question which you might have seen, it's from Jenny Rathor. I think it kind of picks up a slightly different angle. How did people cope with the Spanish flu in terms of dealing with stress and anxiety? And these days we have mental health capabilities or understanding and technology and work from home. Yeah. In the absence of all of that, what was the mental health situation or stress and anxiety situation at that time?
Immense. You can imagine if 200,000 people are dying every day, it's an immense shock. You just see, people like Gandhi, Tagore lost family members in the flu. People were devastated. Savarkar, if I'm not mistaken, his father died of the plague and so on. This is a time period where the life expectancy rate at birth is between 20 and 25 years. Concept like grandparents are not well known actually in the late 19th and early 20th century, because people are not living that long. Right? So this is a completely different world, and you're absolutely right that massive amount of depression is there. And it's interesting when you see debates on lockdown back then, even they had debates on should we lock down or not. The doctors' reports that I found in my research was saying, when they were weighing the pros and cons of lockdown, an important thing which they said back then was that if we lock down, we will add on to the depression. They use the word anxiety, they use the words depression. Right? So these things were in the common parlance back then. And most of the times there was no forced lockdown back then. Right? And interestingly, one of the reasons that they were saying is that if we do a lockdown, we will add to these kind of mental anxiety. But a lot of this was prayers. I give you example from Calcutta of managing the plague, where there were a lot of these Sam Kirtanas, as they called it there, and a lot of bhajans and so on. A lot of interesting anecdotes in this book, by the way, on how people coped up with stress, but basically solidarity. One of the things I point out is influenza led to the rise of the labor movement. So many people died. It gave the bargaining power to labor, and India's labor movement really picks up after 1918. But the cooperative movement in India, the cooperative, like companies like Amul and so on, the genesis of the cooperative movement in India starts from the first decade of the 20th century. And it starts off in the context of the plague. That is, a lot of the people who set up cooperatives are people who are there in plague management circles. And so clearly there is this class of people interested in providing support for the community. And I think so there's a connection clearly of civil society again stepping up, okay, and providing certain mechanisms to cope with what is happening, because it is clearly very, very traumatic, much more traumatic back then than now. One of the memoirs I quote from in the book is Smriti Chitre. And Smriti Chitre is a lovely Marathi autobiography by Lakshmibai Tilak, written in the 1930s. And she has written about both surviving plague. Her daughter had got plague, but somehow she miraculously survives. And it's a very heart-rending account. They're kept in these plague isolation camps, horrible conditions, freezing cold. And she had kind of almost given up. And then there's this particular thing in the memoir. She wraps up her daughter with a particular ingredient, and then literally goes into the forest and just yells and prays, saying, please save my daughter. In that particular one incident, her daughter survives actually. And she kind of prays, saying, if God, if you save my daughter, I will work for the betterment of plague victims. And in this case, actually, it does happen. And so then she, puts in an effort to help others in the camp. So there's also a sense of solidarity, which kind of comes about in this period of exceptional hardship of those times.
Great, Chinmay. I think we have overextended your our use of your generosity in terms of time and learning. So we will not hold you any longer. We will hold you to your promise to come back here every time you write a book. So we'll keep looking at the publishing news, and as soon as we see a book, you expect a call from us. So I'll pass you back to Asha to close the session. And any final comments from Asha?
Yeah, I'm sure everyone can agree that this session with Professor Chinmay has really whetted our appetites to confront and not run away from the issues that we face today and be better informed. Thank you so much, Chinmay, and also everyone who has attended today. And please stay safe and take care.
Thanks a lot, Asha. And I should point out that Asha has helped me in many sections, in providing some of the research for the book. So thanks again to Ahmedabad University for getting such bright students and contributing to this book project in a very direct manner.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night, everyone. Bye-bye. Thank you.